Ayrton Senna is easily one of the most legendary Formula One drivers of all time, but despite the amount of media about him, there's one chapter of his life that often gets missed out. Despite that, I think it's one of the most important parts of his story and explains a lot about his personality and the kind of person he became. This is a part of a longer piece I'm writing about the years leading up to McLaren's 1988 season. With the Senna Netflix series coming out soon, I hope that they might finally cover this part of his life, but otherwise, I thought it'd be interesting to get this out and compare. I've never done anything like this before, so I'm sorry if some parts seem rushed, but I would love any feedback if you do have it. Without further ado, here is the time that one of F1's greatest legends gave up on racing. The heart of motor racing is in England, and that meant that Ayrton da Silva was a long way from home. The young Brazilian had finished twice as the runner-up in the European Karting Championships, and in 1981 was competing in single-seaters for the first time. Da Silva was talented in a raw, unpolished kind of way. Impatient and aggressive to a fault, he ended up off track just as often as he'd successfully overtake. Despite his inexperience and frequent mistakes, he had a raw speed that only a few could match. Outside of the cockpit, he was shy and awkward. He was already quiet to begin with, but with the language barrier, he easily disappeared into the background. The truth was that in those days, it was his wife Liliane who often left a bigger impression. Liliane Vasconcelos de Souza was his childhood sweetheart, and they'd finally gotten married before moving to England. Liliane came with him to all his races, and although they struggled with the weather, the food, and the language, it was with her by his side that Da Silva won his first international championship. Stepping onto the podium after the final race, someone asked Ayrton what was next, and it was only a small surprise when he said he'd be moving back home to Brazil. Racing is an expensive hobby, especially for someone who had to travel so far just to be there, and it was normal enough for people to disappear as they picked up responsibilities. Da Silva had looked around for sponsors, but everyone's attention at the time was fixed on Nelson Piquet, the Brazilian who had just won his first Formula One championship. There was little interest in some kid putting around in the amateurs. Brazil was entering a recession, and Milton da Silva called back his son to help out at his businesses. Ayrton's father had bankrolled his racing, but with the cost mounting and his son reaching adulthood, it was time for him to start planning ahead. Ayrton's first experience with an engine came when he was just 4. Milton built a basic kart for his son using an old lawnmower engine and a simple frame. That was what started his lifelong obsession with racing, which became the hobby that filled his childhood. Now, being asked to consider what his life would be like after racing, Ayrton struggled to find an answer, and over that summer he fell into a depression. Ayrton wanted desperately to go back to Europe, but if he did, he would go back on his own. He would have his parents' permission, but not their support, and there was no way Liliane would follow. She couldn't stand the idea of another year without her friends and family, spending all the time in chilly workshops and pit lanes. This decision would define the next several years of Ayrton's life. So, while Liliane filed for divorce, Ayrton boarded a plane to England. When he arrived, he was a different person. This is where the story of Ayrton Senna begins. Da Silva is the most common surname in Brazil, and Ayrton needed to stand out. This was one part of his transformation as he dedicated his whole life to making it to Formula One. One of the first people he contacted on his return was Keith Sutton, a scrappy photographer he'd met the year before. Sutton ended up becoming one part manager, one part PR firm, and at his suggestion started typing out press releases that he'd send to every team he could find an address for. Whenever he raced, he made sure there were photos to show potential sponsors back home. Although this was a feeder series, Senna started acting as if he was a pro already. There's an interesting quote where Senna discusses why he chose the series he did and didn't compete in Formula 2. It wasn't enough for him to be competitive or just to win, he needed to dominate. Part of the mystique around him was deliberately crafted to help him succeed. The other part was a coping mechanism. Hearing quotes about Senna reminds me of people who say that Steve Jobs had a reality distortion field around him. Senna needed to exist in a reality where he succeeded and made it all the way. He couldn't stop to consider any other possibility, or the doubts would break him. At the same time, though, that self-belief allowed him to perform miracles. Whether it was confidence or desperation or divine inspiration, sometimes Senna could pull off something no one else could do. He would win a race and reveal that his brakes had been disconnected since the first lap, and just tell second place that he'd been braking too early. Senna was dominant in every series he touched. The results were undeniable, and his efforts to get the attention of Formula One team managers paid off. Frank Williams was the first person to give him a taste of a Formula One car, although he made clear that there was no contract for him. Senna took this opportunity and invited a Brazilian TV crew as well as Keith Sutton to take pictures. What was meant to be a private test became an opportunity to make everyone think of him as a Formula One driver. The first person to offer him an actual contract was Ron Dennis. He offered to sponsor his Formula 3 drive and hire him as a reserve driver. Senna turned this down as McLaren had yet to get a turbo engine and was still a back marker. He refused to drive for a team that wasn't competitive and turned down a similar offer from Tolman for the same reason. Alex Hawkridge commented that his goal wasn't to get into Formula One, but to dominate it. Senna came close to signing for either Brabham or Lotus, but in both cases the team sponsors shot it down. Brabham already had Nelson Piquet, who saw no point in having two Brazilians on the team, and Lotus's sponsors preferred to have a Briton. So somehow, Ayrton Senna got to the end of 1983 with no clear path into Formula One. He reopened talks with Tolman, but the negotiations went back and forth. The most important clause he negotiated was the option to leave the team at any time by buying out his contract. From the beginning, Senna made it obvious he wasn't planning to stay there for long. Still, that meant that Senna had made it most of the way, and he was confident that he would still find a way to impress the people he needed to. There's one race that has to be mentioned in any discussion of Senna's career, and that's the Monaco Grand Prix of 1984. This was a race that changed the course of Senna's career, but not for the reason most people talk about. Before Prost took the lead of the race, it was Nigel Mansell who was ahead of the pack in first place. Driving for Lotus, it was his British citizenship that had locked Senna out of a drive for the team a few years earlier. Mansell had clear air to control the pace, and given the monsoon conditions, nobody wanted to get too close. But Mansell had a slide and hit the barrier, which took him out of the race. It was this mistake that sealed his fate. Peter Ward, the manager of Lotus at the time, reacted with the unforgettable quote, "Nigel Mansell will never win a Grand Prix as long as I have a hole in my ass." Ward's proctologist has been unavailable for comment. What happened next was the stuff of legends. It was a time before safety cars, and Senna blazed through the field. He made it up to second before the race was called off, and although this was an incredible result by any means, many still think that this should have been his first win. Regardless, this cleared the way for Senna to join Lotus, and finally gave him the car he thought he deserved. What happened next will need to be a story for another time. Hello, if you are hearing this, then wow, you watched the whole thing. I really didn't expect that, so thank you, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did sit through the whole thing or have any feedback, please leave a comment. I would love to hear it, and thank you so much for watching. This is something I have wasted plenty of my spare time doing, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.